everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill, the show where we bring you the bitter pills of truth that a lot of people don't want to swallow, but we need to understand them in order to be able to change the world we live in. And the corporate media would rather we didn't know about those bitter pills. So you guys may have been wondering when I'm going to get a haircut, because when I started this channel like 6 months ago, I had short hair, but I guess this is COVID hair because I haven't been to either a barber or into any building really, unless I absolutely had to, which was maybe once in like 3 months. So that's the way it is for now. Anyway, today I want to talk about the killing of George Floyd and its aftermath, and what that tells us about the American police as an institution, and what needs to be done about it in a general sense. Now, I want to focus mainly on the problem, and we'll maybe do another episode where I cover solutions. So I'm going to kind of put my social psychologist hat on today, since certainly the question of collective violence and the situational factors, as well as personal factors that contribute to it, is definitely a psychological issue. So George Floyd was killed by Officer Derek Chauvin, who knelt on his neck. And so initially, he was a focus, but then, of course, we also saw one of the four officers that were there kind of standing guard and making sure that bystanders didn't interfere with his partner murdering somebody. And then a later video also revealed that there were, as you can see, 3 officers kneeling on George Floyd. And one of the autopsies that was done showed that this guy right here kneeling on his back was also restricting George Floyd's breathing. So I know this is hard to watch, but why don't we take a look here at some of this video, and you can see how they all kind of collaborate in the murder of George Floyd. It certainly appears, and what does that tell us about police in general? Okay, so this is as they were first arresting him.
Hey, please, man. Please. Please let me stand. Please, man, I can't breathe. I'm about to just die in this thing. Relax. Man, I can't breathe in my face. Just get up.
So they're telling him to get up while they're all kneeling on him.
I think it's tough, guy. He's not even resisting the rest, bro.
His whole nose is
Follow with him. Bro, but why you just sitting there? He ain't doing nothing. Now put him in the car.
Don't kill me.
How long y'all gotta hold him down?
Why we don't do drugs, kids? It ain't about drugs, bro. Y'all understand
Yeah,
that?
y'all don't gotta put y'all right.
He is human, bro.
His nose is
But I'm saying you
bleeding.
can put him in the car.
Okay, so you can see there's bystanders protesting what's happening, and then they kneel on him for 8.5 minutes, 8 minutes and 45 seconds, it turns out. And so let me close that out. So let me just go through a detailed account of the actual murder of George Floyd. So at 8:13, Quing and Lane, 2 of the arresting officers, or the initial arresting officers, told Floyd he was under arrest for supposedly passing a $20 bill that was counterfeit at the grocery store. Of course, they don't really know if it was counterfeit or if he knew that it was. Floyd fell to the ground next to the car. The officers picked him up and placed him against the car's door. According to prosecutors, Floyd told the officers that he was not resisting, but that he was claustrophobic and did not want to sit in the car. There was video prior to what you saw of him initially being arrested. A Minneapolis Park police officer arrived and guarded Floyd's vehicle and the two people who had been in it with Floyd. The vehicle was parked over by the restaurant where he supposedly passed the bill. At 8:17, a third police car arrived with officers Derek Chauvin and Tu Tao, who joined King and Lane. Chauvin assumed command. According to prosecutors, Floyd told the officers that he could not breathe while they tried to force him into the car. Around 8:18, security footage from Cup Foods showed King, I don't know how you say that name, struggling with Floyd for at least a minute in the driver's side back seat while Tao watches. At 8:19, standing on the passenger side of the vehicle, Chauvin pulled Floyd across the back seat from the driver's side to the passenger side, then out of the car. Floyd, still handcuffed, fell to the pavement where he lay on his chest with his cheek to the ground. I think they might have meant the other way around here because he was on the left side, the driver's side of the car when they killed him. Anyway, Floyd stopped moving around 8:20, though he was still conscious. Multiple witnesses began to film the encounter, and their videos were widely circulated on the internet. At 8:20, a witness across the street began recording the video that you just saw there, showing three of them kneeling on Floyd. And this witness stopped filming when one of the officers ordered him to leave. So they're trying to minimize witnesses to what they were doing. Also at 8:20, a second person standing near the entrance of Cup Foods began recording the incident. Floyd can be heard repeatedly saying, "I can't breathe, please, and mama." Floyd repeated at least 16 times that he could not breathe. At one point, a witness said, "You got him down, let him breathe." After Floyd said, "I'm about to die," Chauvin told him to relax. An officer asked Floyd, "What do you want?" Floyd answered, "I can't breathe." Floyd stated, "Please, a knee on my neck. I can't breathe." At approximately 8:22, the officers called for an ambulance on a non-emergency basis, escalating a call to emergency status a minute later. So they note that he's in distress. And yet Chauvin continued to kneel on Floyd's neck. A passerby yelled to Floyd, "Well, get up, get in the car, man." And Floyd, still handcuffed and face down on the pavement, responded, "I can't." Floyd cried out, "Mama," twice. Floyd said, "My stomach hurts, my neck hurts, everything hurts," requested water, and begged, "Don't kill me." One witness pointed out that Floyd was bleeding from the nose. Another told the officers that Floyd was not even resisting arrest right now. He's not even moving, actually. Tao countered that Floyd was talking, "He's fine." Tao is the officer standing guard. So he's actively countering claims that they're hurting Floyd. The witness replied, "Floyd ain't fine. Get him off the ground. You could have him in the car by now. He's not resisting arrest or nothing. You're enjoying it. Look at you. Your body language explains it." As Floyd continued to cry for help, Tao said to witnesses, "This is why you don't do drugs, kids." By 8:25, Floyd appeared unconscious, and bystanders confronted the officers about Floyd's condition. Chauvin pulled out mace to keep bystanders away as Tao moved between them and Chauvin. Bystanders repeatedly yelled that Floyd was not responsive right now and urged the officers to check his pulse. King checked Floyd's wrist but found no pulse. The officers did not attempt to provide Floyd with medical assistance. According to a criminal complaint against Chauvin, Lane asked Chauvin twice if they should move Floyd onto his side, and Chauvin said no. A witness asked, "Did they fucking kill him?" At 8:27, the ambulance arrived. A young relative of the owner of Cup Foods attempted to intervene, but was pushed back by Tao. Emergency medical technicians checked Floyd's pulse, didn't find one. And Chauvin continued to keep his knee on Floyd's neck for almost a minute after the ambulance arrived, despite Floyd being silent and motionless. When he finally did lift his knee, it had been there for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So, this sure seemed like premeditated murder to me. They might not have planned it, in advance of their arresting him. We don't know. But there was no reason for Chauvin to be kneeling on Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes, continuing after the ambulance arrived, and well after they realized enough that he was in distress to call an ambulance. And yet, this officer, Tao, tells the crowd that he's fine, after they've called the ambulance. Yeah, he's fine. So, Floyd was unconscious for several minutes before finally, he's dead, and Chauvin takes his knee off of his neck. So all four of these guys clearly knew what was going on, and they collaborated in making sure that no one intervened, and one of them also basically helped Chauvin strangle the guy. And, this is nothing new. More than 1,000 people are killed by police each year. And in the vast majority of cases, there was no immediate threat to an officer's life. Although the U.S. isn't the only country with a high rate of police violence, Brazil, for example, also has a very high rate of police violence, it's one of a very few that have anything remotely approaching this level of police killing civilians. There are several times as many people killed by police in the U.S. as the vast majority of other countries, often dozens of times as many. So whereas routinely police in the U.S. kill over 1,000 people a year, there are many countries in Europe that have in a given year, none, or one, or three, or something like that. So it's just very discrepant from what any industrialized country's police do. Disproportionately, these are people of color. In 2015, according to one study, unarmed black people were killed by police at a rate 5 times the rate of unarmed white people. And breakdown of overall rates of being killed by law enforcement among different ethnic groups. Native Americans were at the top of the list there. African Americans, nearly 3 times, and it is 3 times in some studies. It kind of depends on the year. The rate of white people being killed by the cops. Hispanic or Latino folks about twice as likely proportionally to be killed as white people. Some people say, well, the majority of the people killed by the police are white. Well, yeah, that's true. And, we should, of course, recognize that nobody should be killed by police. And a lot of people, regardless of ethnicity, are killed by police. But, it also should be recognized that, there is a very big discrepancy where, with the exception of Asians and Pacific Islanders, people of color get killed by police at a much higher rate. Of course, it's not just the police that are the problem, but the criminal justice system as a whole. So you can see there, the U.S. has over 2 million people at any given point in time in prison or jail. And city and county jails have a very high rate of turnover. So within the course of, say, a year, a lot more than 2 million people go through the jail, and several million people overall are involved in the criminal justice system at any point in time. And that's just way out of proportion to other countries. Let's look at incarceration rates per 100,000. So there's no other wealthy industrialized country, unless you consider Bahamas to be, I guess, that has anywhere close to the same rate of incarceration per 100,000 people as the United States. There's just not anybody even close. Russia has roughly half the number of people per capita in prison. Let's see, going on down the list, let's see where another European country is. Gosh, we gotta go way down here. Well, there's New Zealand, about a third of our rate. Poland, yeah, we are way out of line in terms of incarceration, in terms of arrests, sentencing, and that's true for racial disparities too. Black people are arrested about 5 times as often as white people, and the same is true for incarceration. Let's see, I thought I had this pulled up here. Sorry about that. Sentencing. Okay, I'll put this in the description, but take my word for it on the figures. Okay, so it is a criminal justice system as a whole that's the problem, but given what the current protests are about and what's in the eye of the media, I'm going to focus on discussing the problem of the police as an institution. And as you saw with George Floyd, and you have seen in probably in many other cases, it's very often the case that black people killed by the police, are not resisting in any way. They're often killed even though they're not guilty of any crime. They may just be a bystander, like the woman Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, a couple of months ago. Tamir Rice, kid just playing in the park in Cleveland, 12-year-old kid, playing with a toy gun in the park. The police just rolled up and shot him without even talking to him. And this is very common. But this police reaction to the protests has, of course, been exposed for all the world to see, more so than ever, in a particularly outrageous way with George Floyd's murder. And it also happened on top of several other highly publicized police murders of black people. And in the midst of a severe economic crisis, massive numbers of people unemployed, a severe pandemic, our government just going out of its way to screw over the majority of us and use the pandemic as an excuse to give ever more money to the rich. And enough people know that happened to be very angry about that as well. So there was a lot of gunpowder and quite a few sparks in and around the powder keg. And one thing that was that's been even more remarkable was how the police reacted to the protests with, even more of exactly what the protests were about, just extreme, unwarranted violence against people who, in the vast majority of cases, were being quite peaceful. And let me just show you a few examples here. There's a Google document, which I'll put a link to in the description, of several hundred of these incidents where the police just tear gas people or shot rubber bullets at them, often putting people's eyes out or otherwise badly injuring them. Um, Pepper spray, beatings, running into people with their cars, you name it. It's So that's just a small sample of what's been going on. Um, so it's really obvious that these officers have no qualms whatsoever about being violent toward people who are not doing them any harm whatsoever, just peacefully protesting. And obviously, they wouldn't be doing this if they weren't used to not experiencing any consequences whatsoever for their actions. Now, because of the high amount of publicity on these protests and the police violence that's been a response to them, and by the way, that's included violent attacks on the press as well as protesters. Um, so they've received a lot of negative publicity, a lot more even than from what the protests were in reaction to initially, almost. And so there have actually been some consequences for them, arguably not enough, but some police officers have been fired and charged with assault and various other things. So. Um, so they're not necessarily getting away with it as much as they're used to. Now, one incident in particular that struck me and a lot of people was this incident in Buffalo, New York, where a 75-year-old man, a peaceful protester, came up to the police and tried to have a conversation with him, and they just shoved him down, and he fell down and bashed his head very hard. So watch what happens here, and then watch the aftermath of him being shoved down and hitting his head. Let's see. I'm not sure if I can make this smaller. Let me move it. Okay, I'll just move myself out of the way for the moment. Shove him down. Did you hear that?
He is bleeding.
He's bleeding.
He's bleeding out of his ear. Get him better. What the you walking up on me? I'm gonna be dead.
Okay, somebody's yelling at them, and so they arrest him. Okay, let me just show you this again. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention, so maybe you saw it, but
The
I
numbers
missed
look
it.
very good.
No.
Statewide, they look very good for the region.
Okay, let me. Okay, so watch what happens right after they shove him. So somebody's trying to help him, and this guy pushes him away. So they're like, no, we're not going to help this guy. We're just going to keep walking. So it was up to somebody other than cops to get help for this guy. Okay. So the officer just walked by without helping the man, and someone who, one of the cops who wants to help him, is shoved out of the way. So, you know, as a social psychologist, you know, what I have to say about this is just, you know, we're not talking about a few bad apples here. You know, we're talking about a rotten barrel. We're talking about you know, a culture that encourages violence toward others, and you know, several aspects of the social situation that you see illustrated in these incidents you know, encourage and facilitate acts of violence. You know, the police appear to pressure each other to not help or care about people who other officers have injured. And if you go through these incidents, you know, the several hundred clips of these incidents, you'll see many other examples of that. They appear to dehumanize members of the public that they encounter. So, you know, they don't care that guy was an old man. They don't care that, you know, a pregnant woman was you know, just on her way home. You know, they just dragged her out of her car and tased her and beat her. And that was in Atlanta, I believe. And they just don't care. And of course, with their heavy armament and their authority to arrest anybody they want for reasons often they just make up. You know, they don't have to have a good reason to arrest you. I'm sorry to tell you, if you haven't you know, had much interaction with the police, maybe you don't know that, but it's the truth. You know, there are laws, but then there's the police who are a law unto themselves. You know, they just have a great deal more power than most members of the general public. They're also in a situation that we psychologists call deindividuation, meaning that in this case they're all dressed the same. They're all wearing these uniforms. They may be dressed in riot gear, so their face may be partially hidden. You know, they've all got these symbols of authority, the billy club and the gun, and so on and so forth. the tendency in that sort of situation is to think of yourself as being in the social role that you're in, rather than thinking of yourself as you, the unique individual person. And so, in that sort of circumstance, often whatever values and norms that you as an individual have kind of go by the wayside. You lose focus on uh, that and on yourself generally. You're just focused on the situation and on the role that you're playing. The role of the cop in this case. Um, so people just sort of lose their ordinary moral restraints, if they have any, because of their lack of self consciousness. And they also don't have the sense, and this is part deindividuation and part the nature of the institution of the police, they don't feel like they're going to be held individually accountable for their actions. So there are a couple of famous social psychology experiments, which you probably have heard about, or certainly you have if you've taken a psychology course, that are very relevant to understanding the nature of the social situation. And they are Phil Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment and Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments. And I say experiments plural because he ran many different variations on the theme of the authority figure giving orders to people. So in the Stanford Prison Experiment, college students at Stanford University were randomly assigned to role play either prisoners or guards in a pretend prison, a simulated prison environment, as part of an experiment on the nature of social roles. In this case, the role of prisoner versus guard. And a couple of important or several important things to note about this experiment. Some people have criticized it because it wasn't a real prison, and these were college students, not real prisoners or real guards. But there are actually reasons why this is a good thing. In this case, it's a very controlled situation. People are randomly assigned to play the roles of either prisoner or guard. These college students were also pre-screened for mental health before they were allowed to be in the study. And so they were originally going to run the study for 2 weeks, where basically the guards are dressed up as prison guards and given a billy club and mirrored sunglasses so people couldn't see their eyes. A little de-individuation there. They're all dressed in these uniforms. And you have all these symbols, these trappings of power and authority. Zimbardo did tell the guards that they couldn't physically hurt the prisoners in any way, but as far as psychological tactics, really anything goes, anything went. They were allowed to, humiliate the prisoners and make them do mindless chores and colossal amounts of push-ups and so forth as punishment. They had a solitary confinement closet. This was conducted in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford, and they sort of remodeled it to make it look sort of like a prison. And so the students who were randomly chosen to be prisoners in this experiment were actually literally picked up by cops at their homes. So it was like a real arrest. They were taken down to the real police station and fingerprinted and so forth. And then they were dressed in these uniforms that were just kind of like a smock with a prison number on them. And they were only allowed to refer to themselves and others and so forth by their number. And of course, the whole time they know it's not a real prison, and so do the guards. But the situation got so out of hand. The guards got so psychologically abusive toward the prisoners, and a couple of the prisoners had to be let out of the experiment, which they were free to quit if they wanted to. That's kind of standard ethics policy in psychology studies, although Zimbardo's experiment kind of went over the line ethically in some respects. Because the guards got so abusive and the prisoners suffered so much emotionally from the experience, and they were really they lost touch with reality. They started to think of this as a real prison rather than an experiment, and they were asked by the guards at one point to write a letter home to their parents, and a lot of them signed the letter with their prisoner number rather than their name. In any case, this had such a strong impact on the prisoners and on the guards too. The guards were so used to dehumanizing and having power over the prisoners that they really started to think of the prisoners as lesser beings than themselves, even though if it weren't for the flip of a coin, they would have been in the prisoner role themselves. So Zimbardo had to end the experiment after only 6 days. And in fact, he got himself so caught up in the situation, as did his co-researchers and others who assisted with the prison simulation. They all got so caught up in it that they started to think of themselves as being in the roles that they themselves had taken on in the prison. So, for example, Zimbardo was a prison superintendent, rather than thinking of themselves as researchers. So it wasn't until Zimbardo's girlfriend visited the experiment and was just absolutely horrified by what she saw happening that she said, "You need to stop this experiment. If you don't, I'm going to break up with you." And so, dawn broke over like Marblehead, so to speak, and he realized, holy shit, this is just an experiment, and I'm letting terrible things happen to these students who are just role-playing prisoners in a simulation. So he ended the experiment after 6 days, but only after outside intervention. So, well, what does that have to say about, or what does that tell us about cops? Well, if you go back to what we were just talking about, just like in the prison experiment, where the guards had enormous power over the prisoners were basically helpless. You've got these cops who are heavily armed, against, in this case, unarmed protesters or an unarmed man lying on the ground, handcuffed, George Floyd. And they know that they're probably not going to be held accountable if they do something, abusive or arbitrary. They're deindividuated, just like the guards in Zimbardo's prison experiment. And there are a number of other, there are just many social situational factors present in police as an institution that it's really a toxic brew. Now, the other famous psychology study that I wanted to mention to you was Stanley Milgram's experiment on obedience to authority. And what Milgram wanted to do was test how willing just ordinary regular people were to obey the orders of a credible authority figure like a research scientist, because one of the things that you see over and over again in historical incidents where terrible things happen, like the Nazi Holocaust, or a few years after Milgram's experiment, massacres of civilians at My Lai and other places in Vietnam by U.S. troops. Folks often said, they were just following orders. That's what Adolf Eichmann said in the Nuremberg war crimes tribunals. Wait, was it Nuremberg or Jerusalem? Anyway, I'm just following orders. I'm not a bad person. I was just doing what I was told. So Milgram was like, okay, let's see whether, because he noticed that Eichmann didn't seem to be a psychopath or anything like that. He seemed like a pretty normal guy, other than being one of the leading figures in the Holocaust. So I wanted to see, what would happen if you have a authority figure, a research scientist, giving orders to people to do things that they thought might possibly harm somebody. So, so long story short, Milgram set up a situation where the scientists, you put an enormous amount of pressure on the participants, who were just volunteers from New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale was, to deliver what they thought were powerful electric shocks to somebody who thought was another volunteer like themselves, but actually was an accomplice of the experimenter who pretended like he was in a great deal of pain. There were no actual electric shocks given, but in the initial phase of Milgram's experiment, roughly 2/3, about 65% of the participants went to the highest shock level on the shock generator. And they didn't necessarily do so willingly, but they went along because even though they heard the supposed volunteer shrieking in pain and saying, "Please let me out of the experiment, my heart's bothering me," etc. So they really have to wonder whether, despite the experimenter's reassurances, they might really be hurting somebody. But despite that, 2/3 of them obeyed all the way to what they thought was a 450 volt shock. And 1/3 of them obeyed up to a pretty high shock level. I think it was 300, 350, something like that. So, at least to that, they might have gone further. So everybody obeyed the authority figure to some extent, and Milgram ran other variations of the study where he tweaked this or that situational factor, and in some cases he found even more obedience. In other cases, such as when people saw a couple of people disobeying the experimenter, he got a lot less obedience. So, his point was twofold. One, if given the right situation, given the right circumstances, ordinary, average, regular people will obey an authority figure, even when the authority figure asks them to do something that's really quite harmful, or so they think. But, it is a matter of the situation more so than it is the people in the situation. So if you change the situation so the authority figure's not as authoritative, or you see people disobeying the experimenter or whatnot, you can bring that level of obedience down a lot. But in any case, that's not the situation that we have with police. That's a situation more like that initial condition of Milgram's, where he got the very high level of obedience. And there is individual variation in Milgram's study, as there was in the Stanford Prison Experiment. So you had the guards who were very sadistic in Zimbardo's experiment. You had the guards who were pretty harsh and strict, but they were not quite as cruel. And then you had the ones who just kind of went along with whatever, but didn't say anything. And that's kind of like the situation you have with the cops. There's people say, well, there's bad cops, but there's also good cops. Well, the so-called good cops are just, in the vast majority of cases, standing there watching somebody get beaten or killed or whatever, and they're not saying anything. They're not intervening. If they do intervene, they're likely to get fired. If they, there are many cases where whistleblowers in police forces have been fired or even assassinated when they tried to blow the whistle on something. So So these are deep structural problems that we have in police forces. They aren't a matter of a few bad apples that we can just get rid of. It's a matter of the whole barrel being rotten, as I said earlier. And Phil Zimbardo also said the very same thing in talking about the situation with the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq during the Iraq War, where prisoners were tortured by U.S. troops. And he was called as an expert witness because of his fame for the Stanford Prison Experiment. And basically what he said was, this institution, the U.S. military and the U.S. government, is responsible for this, not just the individual guards who torture the prisoners, because they were basically given the green light to do these sorts of things, even though obviously it's a violation of international law and U.S. law and so forth. But anyway, I've heard a lot of well-meaning people recently saying that what we need to do about the problem of police violence is to fire and punish the officers who are violent, provide more and better training to the police, and be more discriminating about who gets hired. And I'm sorry, but that reflects a failure to understand the severity of the problem. First of all, there's a lot of naivete there about how police get hired. They're not trying to pick out the good apples, so to speak, in the way they hire people. They're trying to pick out the fucking bad apples. They are deliberately hiring people who are right-wing and mean-spirited and basically bullies. And Graham Elwood was talking in a YouTube episode he did this morning on his show about a court case where they said that it was perfectly okay for a police department to have a policy where they would not hire police officers over a certain IQ. Literally, they want to hire cops who aren't that bright. That's who they want on their force in this particular case. And I'm sure it's, I'm sure it happens elsewhere. So, in closing, let me just read to you some highlights from an article I found that supposedly was written by a police officer or former police officer. And some people who read the article and responded have said, well, I don't believe he's a real police officer. I don't know. Whoever he is, whether he is a former bastard cop, as he says, there is has a pseudonym, Officer ACAB. What does that stand for? All cops are bastards. So he's a former bastard cop, he says. Or if he's not, he's certainly very well informed about what goes on in police forces. So let's take a look here. I was a police officer for nearly 10 years, and I was a bastard. We all were. My time as a cop is a time in my life I'm ashamed of. It's a time that I hurt people and through inaction allowed others to be hurt. And again, that's a common thing where other cops who aren't being violent look the other way. You don't, like it's part of the culture that you're not supposed to narc on people. It's a time that I acted as a violent agent of capitalism and white supremacy. Now that's one thing that I haven't mentioned so far, but it's very important to realize that contrary to what we're taught, there's more to the mission of the police than maintaining public safety. In fact, the institution of police evolved out of slave patrols during the time of slavery. They were responsible for bringing runaway slaves back to their masters, and they were also either the precursors of police or some of the early police forces were responsible for oppressing Native Americans, killing them or relocating them forcibly. So he says, under the guise of public safety, I personally ruined people's lives, but in so doing, made the public no safer. He says, as someone who went through the training, hiring, and socialization of a career in law enforcement, I wanted to give a first-hand account of why I believe police officers are the way they are. Not to excuse their behavior, but to explain it and to indict the structures that perpetuate it. So it's a social situation. It's a culture. It's not just bad apples. I was a police officer in a major metropolitan area in California with a predominantly poor non-white population. One night during briefing, our watch commander told us that the city council had requested a new zero-tolerance policy. Against murderers, drug dealers, or child predators? No. Against homeless people collecting cans from recycling bins. See, the city had some kickback deal with the waste management company where waste management got paid by the government for our expected tonnage of recycling. So when homeless people, quote unquote, stole the recycling from the waste management company, taking it out of the recycling bin so they could get some cash and put food in their belly, they were, threatening somebody's financial interests. So a sergeant ordered him to arrest a 70-year-old immigrant who didn't speak English, who the sergeant had seen picking a Coke can out of a trash bin. One Coke can. So he was ordered to arrest her for stealing trash. He said, "Sarge, come on, she's an old lady." He said, "I don't give a shit. Hook her up, arrest her. That's an order." And I did. I couldn't even comfort her because I didn't speak Spanish. I felt disgusted, but I was ordered to make this arrest, and I wasn't willing to lose my job for her. If you're tempted to feel sympathy for me, don't. I used to happily hassle the homeless under other circumstances. I researched obscure penal codes so I could arrest people in homeless encampments for lesser-known crimes, like remaining too close to railroad property. We used to have informal contests for who could cite or arrest someone for the weirdest law. DUI on a bicycle, non-regulation number of brooms on your tow truck, etc. As ashamed as I am to admit it, it needs to be said, stripping people of their freedom felt like a game to me for many years. And he says he didn't personally plant drugs or make false arrests or file false reports, but he knew lots of officers who did, and he looked the other way, never told anybody about it. Did I ever confess my suspicions when cocaine suddenly showed up in a gang member's jacket? No, I did not. In fact, let me tell you about an extremely formative experience. In my police academy class, we had a clique of around 6 trainees who routinely bullied and harassed other students. Every quarter, we were to write anonymous evaluations of our squad mates. I wrote scathing accounts of their behavior, thinking I was helping keep bad apples out of law enforcement and believing I would be protected. Instead, the academy staff read my complaints to them out loud and outed me to them and never punished them, causing me to get harassed for the rest of my academy class. That's how I learned that even police leadership hates rats. That's why no one is changing things from the inside. They can't. The structure won't allow it. And that's the point of what I'm telling you. I knew cops that pulled women over to flirt with them. I knew cops who would pepper spray sleeping bags so that homeless people couldn't use them. I knew cops that intentionally provoked anger in suspects so they could claim they were assaulted. I was particularly good at winding people up verbally until they lashed out so I could fight them. Nobody spoke out. Nobody stood up. Nobody betrayed the code. None of us protected the people, you, from bad cops. That is why all cops are bastards. I could write an entire book of the awful things I've done, seen done, and heard others bragging about doing. But to me, the bigger question is, how did it get this way? Every police academy is different, but all of them share certain features. Taught by old cops, run like a paramilitary boot camp where, you're taught the mentality that you better follow orders. There's a hierarchy of authority. Don't question authority. Um, you know, go along with your fellow officers. Don't narc on each other, etc. The majority of my time in the academy was spent doing aggressive physical training and watching video after video of police officers being murdered on duty. So they're trying to teach them to be afraid of and to despise civilians, the general public. To understand why all cops are bastards, you need to understand one of the things almost every training officer told me when it came to using force. I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Meaning, I'd rather kill somebody under dubious circumstances than be dead myself. I'll take my chances in court rather than risk getting hurt. We're able to think that way because police unions are extremely powerful, and because of the generous concept of qualified immunity, a legal theory which says a cop generally can't be held personally liable for mistakes they make, quote-unquote mistakes, doing their job in an official capacity. When you look at the actions of the officers who killed all these people, remember that all the officers who murdered people, often unarmed, often not doing anything wrong, were trained to recite, "I'd rather be judged by 12" as a mantra. Even if mistakes were made, trademark, the city, meaning the taxpayers, meaning you, pays a settlement, not the officer. That's what's meant by qualified immunity. The cops are not held personally responsible, generally speaking. Once police training has promised officers that everyone in the world is out to kill them, the next lesson is that your partners are the only people protecting you. So, you see this often in so many, cults or fraternities or the military or many tight-knit groups. These are your buddies. You're responsible for looking out for each other, and they're the people you care about the most. They hate you for protecting them, they meaning the public, and only I love you, your fellow officer, only I can protect you tactic is familiar to students of abuse. It's what abusers do to coerce their victims into isolation, pulling them away from friends and family and snaring them in the abuser's toxic web. Law enforcement does this too, pitting the officer against civilians. They don't understand what you do. They don't respect your sacrifice. They just want to get away with crimes. You're only safe with us, your fellow officers. Police officers are part of the state monopoly on violence, and all police training reinforces this monopoly as a cornerstone of police work, a source of honor and pride. Many cops fantasize about getting to kill someone in the line of duty, egged on by others that have. And one of my training officers told me about the time he shot and killed a mentally ill homeless man wielding a big stick. He bragged that he slept like a baby that night. Official training teaches you how to be violent effectively, and when you're legally allowed to deploy that violence, you deploy that violence. But unofficial training teaches you to desire violence, to expand the breadth of your violence without getting caught, and to erode your own compassion for desperate people, so you can justify punitive violence against them. So he talks here about things that cops do routinely, which most of you probably know. They lie about all kinds of things when it's to their advantage. They'll plant evidence. They'll threaten you with a more serious crime that they can't prove in order to convince you to confess to the lesser crime that they really want you for. A lot of racial bias, obviously, in the police force. Police officers intentionally use extra painful maneuvers and holds during an arrest to provoke, quote, resistance so they can further assault the suspect. And you've seen all the random wanton acts of violence against innocent people that the cops have been carrying out against these protesters. And this is not something unique to political protests. I've certainly experienced it somewhat, fortunately not personally, but I've seen it happen at protests that I've been at, and I was in kind of a scary situation once in an anti-war protest in D.C. Where we were. This wasn't a big demonstration. It was the Afghanistan war, so unfortunately that was a popular war, pretty small protest. We were surrounded by hundreds of cops in riot gear, being very menacing. They held us there for a couple of hours for who knows what reason, and then they let us go without attacking us, fortunately. Okay, and he goes on to say, well, yeah, sure, sometimes cops do help people, protect women from domestic abusers, arrest murderers and child molesters, and so on and so forth. But he asks the question, did I need a gun and sweeping police powers to help the average person on the average night? The answer is no. When I was doing my best work as a cop, I was doing mediocre work as a therapist or a social worker. So what he's pointing out there is that police are kind of the go-to people you call whenever there's a problem, even if it's a problem like dealing with a mentally ill person that police have basically no training to deal with, next to no training. And it's really quite shocking to learn that cops don't have to go to college. They just have on average, about 20 weeks of training after high school. And then they get to be a cop and have this pretty high-paying job. They get paid a lot more than social workers, for instance, in most cases. And he says, well over 90% of the calls for service I handled were reactive, showing up well after a crime had taken place. And, you're called upon to play all these roles that you're not really qualified to do, and the people who are qualified for it are making less money than you are in most cases. And so basically, it should be very obvious to you that this problem is much bigger than something that can be solved by just giving cops more training or being more careful about hiring and whatnot. It's a culture, it's an institution, it's a set of social circumstances that lead cops to be brutal and so forth on a routine basis, or if they themselves are not, to look the other way and to not narc on their fellow officers. So things like increased training about racial bias or tougher laws because the cops don't follow the law. I think I've mentioned on this show before that some friends of mine who are fellow animal rights activists tried to blow the whistle on some pretty serious violations of animal welfare laws in California and Utah, and instead they were the ones who were charged with felonies, and they didn't enforce the laws on the farms that the farms were violating at all, and that's just normal. Police are a law unto themselves. Police officers, as he says, do not protect and serve people. They do sometimes, he acknowledges, but their main purpose relates to protect and serve the status quo and private property. So just incremental reforms are not going to address the problem. Okay, that's all I want to talk about this time. I just want to lay out the magnitude of the problem. And in a future episode, I'll look at propose solutions that go beyond tinkering around the edges, such as drastically cutting police budgets and allocating money elsewhere, or even abolishing the police as we know it and creating other mechanisms for protecting the safety and security of communities. So I will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.